The smell of coffee wafted through the air, cutting through the pervasive odor of ruins and despair. It was spring 1945 in Bavaria, Germany. The Third Reich had collapsed, leaving in its wake a shattered nation where hunger had become the most pressing enemy for millions of civilians. In a small clearing near the bombed-out village of Oberhausen, an American field kitchen had set up operations to feed displaced persons streaming eastward from the fighting. What happened next would become an unexpected moment of human connection amid the ruins of war, when starving German civilians, drawn by the unfamiliar aroma of real coffee, encountered American soldiers offering something beyond mere calories: dignity. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The coffee that drew those German civilians wasn't just any brew. It was proper American coffee, rich, aromatic, and impossibly luxurious in a land where ersatz coffee made from roasted barley and chicory had been the norm for years. To understand the significance of this moment, we must comprehend the desperate situation in Germany during those final days of World War II and the immediate aftermath. By April 1945, as American forces pushed deep into southern Germany, the Nazi regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich was collapsing into chaos after 12 years of brutal rule. The 42nd Infantry Division, known as the Rainbow Division, had been moving through Bavaria, liberating towns, villages, and concentration camps. Behind them came the logistics units, including field kitchens that were vital for maintaining troop morale and effectiveness. These mobile kitchens, officially designated as Field Kitchen M 1937, were marvels of military efficiency, capable of feeding hundreds of soldiers with hot meals in nearly any condition. They consisted of a large trailer containing cooking equipment, storage for rations, and collapsible serving counters. The standard field kitchen could produce hot meals, bread, and, crucially, coffee for an entire company of soldiers. Captain Robert Thornton commanded the supply unit that included Field Kitchen Unit Number 47, which would become the center of our story. A former restaurant owner from Philadelphia, Thornton had a personal philosophy about food in wartime. In chaos, a hot meal represents order. In destruction, the smell of coffee promises reconstruction. His unit had been following the combat elements of the Rainbow Division through Bavaria, setting up at designated points to feed the advancing troops. On April 29, 1945, just days before Germany's unconditional surrender, Thornton's unit received new orders. They were to divert from their planned route and establish a feeding station for liberated prisoners and displaced persons near the small Bavarian village of Oberhausen. Intelligence reports indicated large numbers of civilians, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, and refugees fleeing the fighting further east were moving through the area. The humanitarian crisis was growing by the hour. The morning was cold and misty when Thornton's convoy of 6 trucks carrying kitchen equipment, supplies, and 24 soldiers arrived at the designated clearing. The location had been chosen carefully, close enough to damaged roads for accessibility, but with enough space to accommodate potentially hundreds of hungry, displaced persons. The men worked with practiced efficiency, unloading equipment and establishing a perimeter. By 09:30 hours, the first pots of coffee were brewing, sending their distinctive aroma into the surrounding woods and bombed-out buildings. Sergeant Michael Levine, the head cook, recalled in a post-war interview, "We were brewing real coffee that morning, not the instant stuff." The brass had decided that these poor displaced folks deserved the real thing. So there I was, making about 30 gallons of proper drip coffee. The smell was something else, especially in that place where everything smelled like wet ashes and desperation. What the Americans didn't realize was that their position was just 3 kilometers from what remained of the village of Oberhausen. Once a picturesque Bavarian settlement of around 600 people, it had been reduced to partially standing structures and rubble by Allied bombing aimed at nearby railway junctions. The remaining population, mostly women, children, and elderly men, had been surviving on whatever they could scrounge. Many had been existing on less than 800 calories per day for months. Among the residents was Elizabeth Muller, a 43-year-old former schoolteacher. Her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943, and her teenage son had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the Nazis' desperate last-ditch civilian militia, in the final months of the war. She hadn't heard from him since February. In her diary, recovered by historians in the 1970s, she described that morning, "There was something on the wind today that I haven't smelled in years. Real coffee. Not the barley substitute we've been drinking, but actual coffee. It called to me like a siren, promising something I'd forgotten existed." Frau Becker noticed it too. "We looked at each other, and without speaking, we knew we would follow that smell, regardless of the risk." The risk Elizabeth referred to was substantial. German civilians had been warned repeatedly about fraternizing with American soldiers. Even with the Nazi regime collapsing, many civilians feared punishment from fanatical Nazi officials or, more immediately, feared the Americans themselves. Propaganda had painted U.S. troops as vengeful savages who would harm German civilians in retribution for the war. This fear was particularly acute among women who had heard terrible stories about the behavior of Soviet troops in Eastern Germany. Nevertheless, hunger is a powerful motivator. Elizabeth and her neighbor Anna Becker, a 67-year-old widow, decided to follow the smell. They were soon joined by 3 other women from the village. The small group moved cautiously through the woods, guided by the tantalizing aroma that promised something they had almost forgotten: normalcy. At the American Field Kitchen, the primary mission that morning was to feed a group of about 200 liberated Polish and Russian forced laborers who had been working at a nearby factory. These individuals, mostly men in their 20s and 30s, had been living in barbaric conditions under Nazi control for years. Many were suffering from malnutrition and related health problems. The first group of 50 former laborers had arrived around 9:45 hours and were being served a breakfast of powdered eggs, bacon, bread, and coffee. Private First Class James Donahue, a 19-year-old from Boston serving as an assistant cook, was manning the coffee station when he first noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. "I thought it might be more of the displaced folks coming in," he later wrote in a letter home, "but these people were different. They were locals, Germans, and they looked terrified but determined. There were 5 women, thin as rails, dressed in clothes that had been patched dozens of times. They stood at the tree line, just staring at us, not daring to come closer." Staff Sergeant William Hayes, who was supervising the serving line, spotted the German women as well. The official policy regarding German civilians was complex and evolving in those final days of the war. The Americans were under orders not to fraternize with the German population, but humanitarian considerations often superseded strict regulations, especially when it came to food and medical care. Hayes approached Captain Thornton, who was overseeing the operation from a makeshift command post established in one of the trucks. "Sir, we've got some locals at the perimeter. Women. They look hungry." Thornton stepped out of the truck and observed the small group of German women standing hesitantly at the edge of the clearing. He had seen that look before, people simultaneously desperate for help and terrified of those offering it. He had encountered similar situations in France and Luxembourg, where civilians emerged from hiding after battles, uncertain whether the Americans represented safety or a new threat. The captain made a quick decision. "Hayes, tell Levine to prepare 5 additional meal portions. Have Specialist Weber approach them. He speaks German. Tell them they can come for food after the displaced persons have been served." Specialist Otto Weber was a German-American soldier whose parents had emigrated from Hamburg in 1925. His fluent German had made him invaluable for civil affairs operations as the Americans moved through Bavaria. Weber approached the women slowly, his rifle slung across his back rather than held at the ready, and called out to them in German, "Ladies, you are welcome to come for food in about 30 minutes after we've served these people who have been in forced labor. We have enough for everyone." Elizabeth Muller later described the moment in her diary. The Americans spoke perfect German, though with an odd accent. "I almost wept when he invited us to come eat. We had expected to be chased away, or worse. Instead, he smiled and said they would feed us. The kindness in that simple offer was almost too much to bear after these years of hardship." The women hesitated, then nodded their understanding. They remained at the edge of the clearing, watching as the Americans efficiently served the former forced laborers. The contrast between the two groups was striking. The laborers, despite their poor physical condition, displayed an almost manic energy. They laughed, some cried with joy, and many tried to express their gratitude to the American soldiers in a babel of languages. The German women, by contrast, stood silently, their faces showing a complex mixture of hunger, shame, relief, and uncertainty. By 10:30 hours, the first group of laborers had been fed and had moved to an assembly area where they would wait for transportation to a displaced persons camp. As promised, Specialist Weber approached the German women again and gestured for them to come forward. Elizabeth was the first to step into the clearing, followed closely by the others. As they approached the serving line, there was a momentary tension. Some of the American soldiers stiffened, their expressions hardening. For many of these young men, these were the first ordinary German civilians they had encountered up close. After years of fighting, months of seeing the evidence of Nazi atrocities, and losing friends to German bullets, their feelings toward the German population were complicated, to say the least. Private Donahue, still manning the coffee station, later wrote, "I won't lie. When those German women came up, I felt anger at first. My buddy Johnson had been killed outside Stuttgart just 2 weeks before. But then I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw they were just hungry people. The oldest one reminded me of my grandmother. Something shifted in me then." The women were each given a tray with powdered eggs, bacon, white bread, the first white bread many had seen in years, and a cup of hot coffee. The portion was standard for the American Army, but seemed like a feast to the starving civilians. They were directed to a log that had been positioned as a makeshift bench near the edge of the serving area. What happened next became the heart of this remarkable story. As the women sat eating their first substantial meal in months, word spread quickly through what remained of Oberhausen. The smell of coffee, combined with the news that Americans were feeding civilians, proved irresistible. Within an hour, more villagers began appearing at the edge of the clearing, first in small groups of 2 or 3, then in larger numbers. By noon, nearly 70 German civilians had gathered, mostly women and elderly men, but including several teenagers. They stood at the perimeter, watching the American operation, with a mixture of longing and apprehension. Captain Thornton found himself facing a dilemma. His unit had supplies to feed the expected number of displaced persons, with some reserve. Feeding the entire civilian population of the surrounding area had not been part of the mission parameters, yet the humanitarian need was obvious. Thornton consulted with his supply officer, Lieutenant James Wilson. "How many extra meals can we provide without compromising our primary mission?" Wilson made a quick calculation. "If we reduce portions slightly and use the emergency reserves, we can probably feed another 100 civilians today. But that's it, sir. After that, we'd be cutting into tomorrow's planned operations." Thornton nodded. "All right. We'll feed as many as we can, prioritizing children and elderly. Pass the word to Weber to explain the situation to them." Specialist Weber approached the growing crowd of German civilians and explained that the Americans would provide food, but had limited supplies. He asked them to prioritize the children, elderly, and those in greatest need. What followed was a remarkable scene that several soldiers later described in letters and interviews. The German civilians organized themselves, with those in better condition, insisting that others go ahead of them. There was no pushing or argument, just a quiet, dignified determination to ensure that the most vulnerable received help first. Sergeant Levine, observing this from the kitchen area, later recalled, "It hit me then that these were just people who'd been through hell, same as everyone else in this godforsaken war. They weren't the cartoonish Nazis from our propaganda films. They were just hungry folks trying to survive." The serving continued throughout the early afternoon. The Americans, originally tense and suspicious, gradually relaxed as the interaction remained peaceful and orderly. Some even began making efforts to communicate with the German civilians despite the language barrier, using gestures and the few German words they knew. The civilians, for their part, seemed overwhelmed by the kindness, with many openly weeping as they received their food. The coffee remained the most powerful symbol of this unexpected moment of humanity. For the Americans, coffee was a basic staple, something they took for granted. For the German civilians, it represented a world they had lost, a world of simple comforts and normalcy that had been sacrificed to the insatiable demands of the Nazi war machine. Elizabeth Miller described the experience in her diary. "The coffee was so strong it made my hands shake. Or perhaps that was emotion. I hadn't tasted real coffee since before the war. That small cup contained memories of Sunday mornings before all this madness began. I sipped it slowly, making it last. Around me, I saw others doing the same, closing their eyes as they drank, remembering a different time." As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The rigid division between the Americans and Germans started to dissolve. Children, with their natural resilience and curiosity, served as the first bridge. A young German boy of about 10 approached Private Donahue and offered him a small carved wooden bird in exchange for an extra piece of bread for his sister. Donahue gave him the bread but refused the carving, telling him through gestures to keep it. The boy seemed confused by this act of unconditional giving. Another soldier, Corporal Ray Martinez from New Mexico, noticed an elderly German man struggling to eat due to missing teeth. Martinez approached with a canteen cup of coffee that he had allowed to cool and some bread that had been soaked to soften it. No words were exchanged, but the old man nodded his thanks with tears in his eyes. These small moments of human connection multiplied throughout the afternoon. Private First Class Sarah Reynolds, one of the few female soldiers assigned to the unit as a clerk, found herself surrounded by German women asking questions that she couldn't understand. Specialist Weber came to translate and discovered they were asking about her uniform, her role, and whether American women had been forced into service, like German women had been compelled to work in factories and farms. Reynolds, through Weber, explained her voluntary enlistment and her duties. The German women listened with fascination, many clearly reassessing their understanding of American society based on this single interaction. One older woman asked if Reynolds had children, and when she showed a photo of her 2-year-old daughter being cared for by her parents back in Minnesota, the barriers seemed to fall completely. They were no longer enemy and victor, but simply women sharing stories of family across the artificial boundaries of conflict. By late afternoon, the field kitchen had served meals to 214 displaced persons and approximately 180 German civilians. The unit's supplies were stretched thin, but the mission had expanded beyond its original parameters in a way that would leave a lasting impact on all involved. As the sun began to set, Captain Thornton received new orders via radio. His unit was to pack up and move 30 kilometers southeast the following morning to support troops engaged in securing a suspected Nazi arms depot. The temporary moment of connection would soon end, but not before creating one final, memorable scene. As the Americans began breaking down parts of the field kitchen and preparing for the next day's journey, Elizabeth Miller approached Captain Thornton with Weber translating. She explained that she had been the village school teacher before the war and asked if she might express the community's gratitude. Thornton, touched by the request, agreed. Elizabeth gathered the remaining German civilians, about 60 people who had lingered in the clearing, and arranged them in a semicircle. Then, in a moment that many of the American soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives, the assembled Germans began to sing. It was not a Nazi anthem or a traditional German military song, but a simple folk melody. Die Gedanken sind frei, thoughts are free, a centuries-old song about the freedom of thought that had been banned during the Third Reich for its message of intellectual liberty. The singing was hesitant at first, voices rusty from disuse and weakened by malnutrition, but it grew stronger with each phrase. Many of the Americans stopped their work to listen. Though they couldn't understand the German lyrics, the emotion behind the singing was universal and unmistakable. Gratitude, relief, and the first fragile tendrils of hope. Private Donahue later wrote, "I didn't know what they were singing, but I knew what it meant. It was a thank you, not just for the food, but for treating them like human beings again." Some of the guys had tears in their eyes, though they'd have denied it if you asked them directly. After everything we'd seen and done in this war, that simple song hit harder than any artillery barrage. As darkness fell, the Germans returned to what remained of their village, many carrying small amounts of additional food that the Americans had pressed upon them. A precious half-loaf of bread here, a tin of meat there, and, for some of the children, their first taste of American chocolate in the form of D-ration bars. These parting gifts, though modest by American standards, represented a lifeline for families who had been subsisting on the edge of starvation. The Americans, meanwhile, continued their preparations for the next day's movement. As they worked, many found themselves reflecting on the unexpected events of the day. For soldiers who had been fighting across Europe since the Normandy landings, the war had often narrowed their vision to the immediate tactical situation, the next hill to take, the next town to secure, the next river to cross. The human dimension of the conflict had frequently been lost in the relentless demands of combat. This day at the field kitchen had shifted something fundamental in their perspective. The German civilians they had fed were not the fanatical Nazis of propaganda posters, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. The simple act of providing food, and especially that aromatic coffee that had first drawn the civilians to the clearing, had created a bridge across the chasm of war. Captain Thornton made a decision that evening that went beyond his orders, but reflected the complex reality on the ground. He instructed Lieutenant Wilson to prepare 10 days' worth of basic rations, mainly flour, powdered milk, canned meat, and coffee, to be left behind for the village when they departed. This diversion of supplies would need to be explained in his report, but Thornton felt it was necessary both as a humanitarian gesture and as a practical measure to promote stability in the area after their departure. "The war is effectively over," he told Wilson. "In a matter of days, maybe hours, Germany will surrender unconditionally. Our job will quickly shift from fighting to occupation and rebuilding. What we do in these early moments will set the tone for what follows." As night fell completely, Elizabeth Muller made one final entry in her diary before seeking sleep in the damaged but still standing school building where she had once taught and now lived. "Today I have seen the face of our conquerors, and it was not what I expected. They came not with vengeance, but with bread and coffee. I do not know what tomorrow will bring for any of us, but today has given me something I had lost entirely: hope. The smell of their coffee led us to them, but it was their humanity that truly fed us." The next morning dawned clear and cold. By 0600 hours, the American field kitchen unit was packed and ready to move out. As the convoy of trucks prepared to depart, Captain Thornton noticed a small group of figures standing at the edge of the clearing. Elizabeth Muller and several other villagers had come to witness their departure. No words were exchanged across the distance, but several soldiers raised their hands in farewell, a gesture the Germans returned. As the trucks rumbled down the damaged road, Specialist Weber turned to Captain Thornton. "Sir, do you think what we did here will make any difference in the long run? There is so much destruction, so much hatred to overcome." Thornton was silent for a moment, watching the Germans grow smaller in the distance. "I don't know, Weber, but if there's going to be peace after all this hell, it has to start somewhere. Maybe it starts with coffee." What none of them could know as they drove away was that this small, seemingly insignificant interaction, German civilians following the smell of American coffee to a field kitchen, would have consequences that would extend far beyond that clearing in Bavaria. The events of that day would ripple outward, touching lives in unexpected ways and becoming part of a larger story of reconciliation and rebuilding in post-war Germany. The connection formed over coffee and food would develop into something more substantial and lasting than anyone could have anticipated as the next phase of their journey was about to unfold. 3 days after Captain Thornton's unit departed from Oberhausen, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The war in Europe was officially over, but the immense task of reconstruction was just beginning. The American forces quickly transitioned from combat operations to occupation duties, and the feeding of civilians became a central concern as the full extent of food shortages in Germany became apparent. The immediate post-surrender period saw the implementation of the Allied occupation policy, dividing Germany into 4 zones controlled by American, British, French, and Soviet forces. Bavaria fell within the American zone, and military government teams began the complex process of reestablishing civil administration in a shattered society. Food security was immediately identified as the most urgent issue, with caloric intake for the average German civilian estimated at between 800 and 200 calories per day, far below the 2,000 calories considered necessary for basic health. Major General Lucius D. Clay, deputy military governor of the American zone, faced difficult decisions about resource allocation. The devastated European transportation infrastructure, combined with poor harvests and the disruption of normal agricultural production, created a perfect storm of food insecurity. The situation was further complicated by the presence of millions of displaced persons and refugees who needed to be fed while awaiting repatriation or resettlement. Against this backdrop, the story of Oberhausen and Captain Thornton's field kitchen might have remained just one of countless small interactions between occupiers and occupied during those chaotic days. However, a series of circumstances would elevate this particular incident into something more significant. 2 weeks after the German surrender, Colonel James Peterson, the regional military government officer responsible for the district that included Oberhausen, received a letter written in careful English. It came from Elizabeth Müller, who had taught English in addition to her primary subjects before schools became instruments of Nazi ideology. In the letter, she described the field kitchen incident and expressed gratitude on behalf of the village. More importantly, she proposed a local initiative. The villagers would help repair a damaged bridge on the supply route if the Americans could provide some basic food assistance. Colonel Peterson was intrigued by this proactive approach. The military government was overwhelmed with the tasks of denazification, reestablishing basic services, and preventing disease outbreaks. A community willing to take initiative rather than passively waiting for aid represented exactly the kind of local engagement the Americans hoped to foster. Peterson decided to visit Oberhausen personally to assess the situation. When Peterson arrived in the village on May 24, 1945, he found Elizabeth Müller had organized a community meeting in the damaged church, the only building large enough to accommodate most of the remaining villagers. Peterson was accompanied by Captain David Silverman, a civil affairs officer assigned to evaluate local governance structures. Elizabeth stood before the assembled villagers and the American officers, speaking in English for the benefit of the Americans, while a neighbor translated into German for those villagers who didn't understand. When the Americans came with their field kitchen, they showed us kindness when we expected punishment. They gave us not just food for our bodies, but hope for our futures. We wish to show that we can be partners in rebuilding, not just recipients of charity. She outlined a simple proposal. If the Americans could provide basic food supplies, flour, powdered milk, and perhaps occasional coffee, the able-bodied residents of Oberhausen would commit to repairing the small bridge over the Kuhnbach stream that had been damaged during the fighting. This bridge was on a secondary supply route used by American logistics units, and its repair would benefit both the military and the surrounding communities. Colonel Peterson was impressed by the presentation and the practical nature of the proposal. Here was an opportunity to address multiple problems simultaneously: improving military logistics, providing targeted food aid that would not drain overall resources, and engaging the local population in constructive work that would give them agency in their own recovery. "Ms. Muller," Peterson responded, "your proposal makes a great deal of sense. Captain Silverman will work with you to develop a formal arrangement. If this proves successful, it could become a model for other communities in the region." What Peterson couldn't have known was that his aide was taking detailed notes of the meeting and included the story of the original field kitchen encounter in his report. This report would eventually reach the desk of General Lucius Clay himself, who was searching for examples of successful civil-military cooperation to incorporate into broader occupation policies. By early June 1945, the Oberhausen model, as it came to be known in military government circles, was being implemented. Captain Silverman established a formal arrangement whereby the village received food allocations sufficient to provide approximately 1,500 calories per person per day, still below normal requirements, but a significant improvement over previous levels. In exchange, the villagers committed to specific reconstruction projects, beginning with the bridge repair. The work commenced on June 12th, with 27 villagers reporting for the first day of labor. Among them was Friedrich Weber, Elizabeth's teenage son, who had survived his Volkssturm service and made his way home in the chaotic days after the surrender. The work was difficult, especially for people weakened by years of inadequate nutrition, but there was a palpable sense of purpose among the workers. They were no longer passive victims of circumstances, but active participants in rebuilding their community. Captain Silverman arranged for an Army engineer, Lieutenant Howard Phillips, to provide technical guidance for the bridge repair. Phillips, a civil engineer from Chicago in civilian life, found himself impressed by the ingenuity of the German workers, who compensated for lack of proper materials and equipment with creative solutions and meticulous craftsmanship. "These people know how to make something from nothing," Phillips wrote in his weekly report. "Given the limited resources available, their progress is remarkable. They've developed a work rotation that accounts for individual strength and skills, ensuring that no one is overtaxed while maximizing productivity." The bridge repair project created unexpected opportunities for human connection. The American soldiers assigned to deliver food supplies and monitor the project initially maintained a formal distance from the German civilians. However, as days passed, informal interactions became more common. Soldiers would occasionally help with particularly heavy lifting, share cigarettes during breaks, or attempt to communicate despite language barriers. One soldier, Corporal Michael D'Angelo from New York, had brought a soccer ball with him and began impromptu games with the younger German workers during lunch breaks. These games gradually attracted more participants from both sides and became a regular feature of the project. Through play, relationships developed that transcended the official categories of victor and vanquished. Elizabeth Muller documented these evolving interactions in her diary. "It is strange to see how quickly human connections form when people work together toward a common goal. 2 weeks ago, these young American men were fearsome occupiers. Now they are individuals with names and stories. Joseph has learned several American baseball terms. Friedrich plays soccer with them during the midday break. Frau Becker has taught a young soldier named Mike how to properly slice our dense bread." These small exchanges matter more than any official policy. By early July, the bridge was nearing completion. The project had proven more successful than anyone anticipated, not just in terms of the physical infrastructure, but in building relationships and demonstrating a model for constructive occupation. Captain Silverman invited Colonel Peterson to inspect the work and consider expanding the approach. Peterson arrived on July 7th, accompanied by several staff officers and, unexpectedly, a reporter and photographer from Stars and Stripes, the U.S. Armed Forces newspaper. The military was beginning to recognize the importance of highlighting positive civil-military interactions for both American and German audiences. The timing of the visit coincided with an informal celebration the workers had planned to mark the near completion of the bridge. The German women had pooled their resources to prepare a modest meal for all the workers, American and German alike. When Peterson's group arrived, they found Americans and Germans sharing food at improvised tables near the bridge site. The centerpiece of this meal was coffee, real American coffee that had been provided through the Food Allocation Program. The Germans had stretched the precious commodity by brewing it carefully and serving it in small cups, but the symbolic importance far outweighed the actual amount. This was the same aroma that had first drawn the villagers to the American field kitchen, now transformed into a symbol of cooperation and renewal. The Stars and Stripes photographer captured a powerful image. Elizabeth Mueller serving coffee to Lieutenant Phillips and Friedrich Weber as they stood on the nearly completed bridge. Behind them, other Germans and Americans sat together at rough tables, sharing a meal. The photo would appear in the July 15, 1945 edition under the headline, "Coffee Diplomacy: How One Bavarian Village is Building Bridges," literally. The accompanying article recounted the story of the original field kitchen encounter and described how it had evolved into a successful reconstruction project. The reporter, Sergeant James Barrett, concluded with a quote from Colonel Peterson, "What we're seeing in Oberhausen is a microcosm of what needs to happen across occupied Germany." Reconstruction isn't just about rebuilding infrastructure, it's about rebuilding trust and giving people a stake in their own recovery. The Stars and Stripes article caught the attention of military government officials throughout the American zone. General Clay requested a full briefing on the Oberhausen project as he worked to develop more effective occupation policies. The central insight that providing basic necessities while engaging Germans in meaningful reconstruction work yielded better results than either punitive measures or unconditional charity would eventually influence the broader approach to German recovery. By August 1945, the Oberhausen model was being replicated in dozens of communities across Bavaria. Military government officers were identifying local projects that served both military and civilian needs, establishing food-for-work arrangements and encouraging direct interaction between American personnel and German civilians. This grassroots approach complemented the higher-level economic and political reconstruction efforts being formulated in Washington and Berlin. For the village of Oberhausen itself, the bridge project marked the beginning of a remarkable recovery. With improved transportation links, the community gained better access to regional food distribution and medical services. The relationships formed with American occupation personnel helped navigate the complex bureaucracy of occupation, securing permissions and resources that might otherwise have been unobtainable. Elizabeth Miller emerged as an informal but effective community leader during this period. Her language skills, education, and the respect she commanded made her a natural intermediary between the villagers and the occupation authorities. In September 1945, when the Americans began implementing local self-government under military supervision, Elizabeth was elected to the village council, one of the first German women to hold such a position in the post-war period. Captain Thornton, whose field kitchen had sparked this chain of events, learned of Oberhausen's story in October 1945. His unit had been deployed through various parts of the American zone before receiving orders to return to the United States as part of the gradual drawdown of forces. Before leaving Germany, Thornton requested permission to visit Oberhausen, which was granted. On October 23, 1945, Thornton arrived in the village, which he barely recognized. When his field kitchen had operated in the nearby clearing 6 months earlier, Oberhausen had been a collection of damaged buildings inhabited by starving, traumatized people. Now, though still far from restored to pre-war conditions, there were clear signs of recovery. Rubble had been cleared from the main street. Several buildings had been repaired, and the residents moved with purpose rather than desperation. Elizabeth Miller welcomed Thornton at the newly established village office in what had once been the schoolhouse. "Captain Thornton," she said, shaking his hand warmly, "you probably don't remember me, but I was among the first group of women who came to your field kitchen." "I remember," Thornton replied, somewhat surprised at how clearly he recalled her face among the hundreds of civilians his unit had encountered. "You were the one who organized the singing before we left." She nodded, pleased that he remembered. "That day changed everything for us, not just because of the food, though God knows we needed it, but because you treated us as people worthy of dignity. That gave us the courage to believe in possibilities again." Thornton spent the day in Oberhausen, visiting the completed bridge and meeting with villagers who remembered the field kitchen. Many expressed their gratitude, but what struck Thornton most was how the initial act of humanitarian assistance had evolved into something more sustainable and empowering. That evening, the village council hosted a small dinner in Thornton's honor at the partially repaired church. The meal was modest by American standards, but represented a significant improvement over the desperate conditions of the immediate post-war period. And once again, coffee featured prominently, served in the village's best remaining cups, which had been hidden away during the bombing. During the dinner, Elizabeth presented Thornton with a small, hand-carved wooden box made by Friedrich. Inside was a handwritten account of how the field kitchen visit had affected the village, signed by dozens of residents. "So you will remember that even in war's darkest moments, humanity can prevail," Elizabeth explained, "and that sometimes the path to reconciliation begins with something as simple as the smell of coffee." Thornton was deeply moved by the gesture. In his diary entry that evening, he wrote, "When we set up that field kitchen, we were just following orders: feed the displaced persons, maintain operational readiness. We had no idea that such a routine mission would spawn something of such significance. It makes me wonder how many other small acts of decency in this war might be bearing fruit in ways we'll never know." The following day, before departing, Thornton presented Elizabeth with a gift of his own, a small supply of real American coffee beans and a letter of commendation from Colonel Peterson acknowledging her leadership. "This is just the beginning," Thornton told her. "The road ahead won't be easy, but what you've accomplished here proves that recovery is possible." As 1945 drew to a close, the story of Oberhausen began to reach beyond military circles. In December, Elizabeth received a letter from Eleanor Roosevelt, who had read about the village in a report on occupation successes compiled for President Truman. The former First Lady expressed her admiration for the community's initiative and resilience, writing, "In your village's story, I see hope for a new Germany that can rejoin the family of nations." The international attention brought unexpected benefits. When the Methodist Committee for Overseas Relief learned about Oberhausen through Mrs. Roosevelt's interest, they arranged for a special shipment of supplies to the village, including 3 industrial sewing machines that allowed the establishment of a small textile workshop where women could earn income repairing and making clothing. By early 1946, the acute phase of the post-war food crisis was easing slightly, though conditions remained difficult throughout Germany. The harsh winter of 1945-1946 had exacerbated food shortages, and the average caloric intake in the American zone still hovered around 550 calories per day, adequate for survival but not for robust health. The Oberhausen model had evolved during this period. What began as a simple food-for-work arrangement had expanded into a more comprehensive approach to community rehabilitation. With American technical guidance and limited material support, the villagers had moved beyond the bridge repair to other projects: clearing rubble, repairing the water system, restoring the school building, and establishing a community garden on previously unused land. In February 1946, a significant development occurred when General Clay authorized the establishment of a pilot program based on the Oberhausen experience. 10 communities in Bavaria would receive focused assistance and technical support in exchange for self-directed reconstruction efforts. The program would test whether the approach could be scaled effectively and provide data for potential broader implementation. Colonel Peterson, who had been promoted to oversee civil affairs for a larger region, selected Oberhausen as the coordination center for this pilot program. This meant that Elizabeth and other community leaders would help train representatives from other villages in organizing effective reconstruction initiatives. On February 23, 1946, delegates from the 10 selected communities gathered in Oberhausen's newly repaired school building. Elizabeth, now formally recognized as the Community Rehabilitation Coordinator, opened the meeting by sharing the village's journey from desperate hunger to purposeful recovery. "When we followed the smell of coffee to that American field kitchen," she told the assembled delegates, "we were thinking only of survival, of filling empty stomachs. We could not have imagined that this simple human encounter would lead to a new model for rebuilding our communities. What we have learned is that true recovery comes not from waiting for others to save us, but from finding ways to save ourselves with appropriate support." The meeting established a regional coordination committee that would meet monthly to share best practices, coordinate resource requests, and document outcomes. This grassroots approach to reconstruction complemented the higher-level Marshall Plan discussions that were beginning to take shape in Washington and European capitals, though the full Marshall Plan would not be formally announced until 1947. Captain Thornton, now back in the United States and working for his family's restaurant business in Philadelphia, maintained correspondence with Elizabeth. In March 1946, he received a package from Oberhausen containing photographs of the reconstruction projects and a small cloth pouch of German-grown beans mixed with American coffee, symbolic of the collaboration that had developed. Accompanying the package was a letter from Elizabeth describing the expansion of the Coffee Bridge program, as it was now being called locally. Thornton was so moved by the ongoing impact of what had begun as a routine field kitchen operation that he decided to take action. He approached the Philadelphia Rotary Club with the story of Oberhausen and proposed establishing a sister community relationship to provide additional support. The Rotary members, many of them veterans themselves, were intrigued by the positive narrative of post-war reconstruction and agreed to sponsor a relationship. By summer 1946, the Philadelphia Oberhausen Partnership was formalized. The Rotary Club arranged shipments of specialized tools, school supplies, and medical items that were difficult to obtain through military government channels. Perhaps most significantly, they established a scholarship fund to allow promising students from Oberhausen to study at Philadelphia educational institutions once travel restrictions eased. The first recipient of this scholarship would be Friedrich Weber, Elizabeth's son, who arrived at Temple University in September 1948 to study civil engineering, inspired by his work with Lieutenant Phillips on the bridge project. Friedrich's journey from teenage Volkssturm conscript to American University student embodied the transformation that was gradually occurring in German-American relations. The story of Oberhausen continued to resonate within American military circles as occupation policies evolved. In a 1947 training manual for occupation personnel, the field kitchen encounter was included as a case study in effective civil-military relations. The manual noted, "The simplest humanitarian gesture, offering food to hungry civilians, generated goodwill that facilitated subsequent governance and reconstruction efforts. Personnel should be alert to similar opportunities to build positive relationships with the local population." By 1948, as the Marshall Plan began full implementation and the Berlin airlift demonstrated American commitment to Western Germany, the acute phase of post-war recovery was transitioning to more sustainable development. Oberhausen, like many communities in what would become West Germany, was experiencing the beginning of the economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, that would transform the country over the next decade. Elizabeth Miller continued her leadership role in local government until 1952, when she returned to her first love, teaching. The school in Oberhausen, fully rebuilt with assistance from the Philadelphia Rotary Club, welcomed her back as headmistress. Under her guidance, the curriculum emphasized international understanding and civic responsibility, shaped by the lessons she had learned during the difficult post-war years. Captain Thornton, meanwhile, expanded his family's restaurant business and became an advocate for international exchange programs. In 1952, he established the Thornton Foundation, which provided support for educational and cultural exchanges between the United States and Germany. The foundation's logo featured a stylized coffee bean, a reminder of how the aroma of coffee had created an unexpected bridge between former enemies. In 1955, a decade after the field kitchen encounter, Elizabeth was invited to the United States as part of a delegation of German community leaders studying American local governance systems. During this trip, she was reunited with Captain Thornton, now Robert to her, in Philadelphia. Together, they visited the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, symbols of the democratic values that were now taking root in West Germany. Over dinner at Thornton's flagship restaurant, they reflected on how a simple humanitarian gesture had spawned connections that transcended the bitterness of war. "I've often wondered," Elizabeth said, "what would have happened if we hadn't smelled that coffee that morning. If we had stayed hidden in our damaged homes, afraid of the Americans as the propaganda had taught us to be." "Someone else would have reached out eventually," Thornton replied. "Humans can't help connecting when given half a chance. But I'm glad it was my coffee you smelled." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a special dessert, coffee ice cream made from a blend of American and German beans, presented by the chef with a small German and American flag on top. This thoughtful gesture moved both Elizabeth and Thornton to tears, symbolizing as it did the sweet outcome of what had begun in such bitter circumstances. The legacy of the field kitchen encounter and the subsequent Oberhausen model extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The approach pioneered in that small Bavarian village, providing basic humanitarian assistance while engaging local communities as partners rather than passive recipients, influenced broader policies of the Marshall Plan and subsequent international development efforts. In 1965, 20 years after the end of World War II, the village of Oberhausen held a commemoration ceremony at the bridge that had been the first community reconstruction project. The bridge, now expanded and improved, had been officially named Coffee Bridge, Kaffeebrücke, in honor of the story that had become central to the community's identity. The ceremony was attended by former military government officials, including the now-retired General Clay, representatives from the Philadelphia Rotary Club, and several of the American soldiers who had been involved in the original field kitchen operation. Captain Thornton, unable to attend due to health issues, sent a recorded message that was played for the assembled crowd. 20 years ago, his voice crackled through the speakers, I commanded a field kitchen unit with the simple mission of feeding displaced persons. We set up in a clearing near your village, brewing coffee that sent its aroma into the surrounding woods. We could not have known that the smell of that coffee would draw people who would change our lives and, in some small way, influence the course of post-war recovery. Today, as you gather at the bridge that symbolizes the rebuilding of not just infrastructure, but trust between our nations, I am reminded that peace is built in small moments of human connection as much as in grand diplomatic agreements. Elizabeth, now in her 60s but still a respected figure in the community, unveiled a small bronze plaque on the bridge. The inscription read, in both German and English, "This bridge, first rebuilt in 1945 through German-American cooperation, stands as a symbol of how former enemies became friends. The path to reconciliation began with the aroma of coffee and the recognition of our common humanity." The story of the field kitchen and the coffee bridge became part of local lore, passed down to subsequent generations as an example of how individual actions could transcend the divisions of war. In schools throughout the region, children learned about how hungry German civilians followed the smell of coffee to an American field kitchen and found not just food, but the beginnings of a new relationship between former enemies. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II, CNN produced a documentary titled Bridges of Recovery that featured the Oberhausen story as one of several examples of grassroots reconciliation between Americans and Germans. The filmmakers interviewed Elizabeth, then 83 years old but still sharp and articulate, in her small apartment overlooking the Kaffeebrücke. "We were so hungry," she recalled for the cameras, "and so afraid. The Nazi propaganda had told us the Americans would be vengeful, brutal, but what we found when we followed the smell of that coffee was something else entirely. Human beings offering food with dignity." That small act of kindness opened a door that we didn't know existed, a door to cooperation rather than continued conflict. The documentary also featured Friedrich Weber, who had completed his engineering degree at Temple University and gone on to work on infrastructure projects throughout West Germany before returning to Bavaria to establish his own engineering firm. Friedrich, who had named his first daughter Eleanor after Mrs. Roosevelt, reflected on how his life had been shaped by the events that began with the field kitchen. "I was a boy who had been indoctrinated into Nazi ideology, then thrust into a hopeless military situation in the final days of the war," he explained. "I could easily have become bitter, resentful of the American occupiers. Instead, because of how they treated our community, beginning with that field kitchen, I saw another path forward. The opportunity to study in America completely transformed my understanding of the world and my place in it." The Oberhausen story's significance extended beyond German-American relations. As humanitarian crises developed in other regions, the lessons learned from the field kitchen encounter and the subsequent reconstruction efforts informed approaches to post-conflict recovery. The principle that effective humanitarian assistance should provide immediate relief while engaging affected communities as active participants rather than passive recipients became increasingly central to international development practice. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the field kitchen encounter, a formal twinning agreement was signed between Oberhausen and Philadelphia, formalizing the relationship that had begun with Captain Thornton's Rotary Club initiative. The ceremony, held at the Kaffeebrücke, was attended by diplomatic representatives from both countries. Elizabeth Mueller, by then 93 years old, was present in a wheelchair accompanied by 3 generations of her family. Though her physical strength had diminished, her mind remained clear, and she insisted on standing briefly to address the gathering. 50 years ago, she said, her voice thin but determined, hungry people followed the smell of coffee to an American field kitchen. We found food for our bodies and, unexpectedly, nourishment for our spirits in the dignity with which we were treated. From that small beginning grew friendship, cooperation, and eventually, true reconciliation. As we stand here today, with Germany and America as allies and friends, let us remember that peace is built in small moments of human connection, over cups of coffee, at shared meals, through acts of kindness that recognize our common humanity despite the divisions of war. Elizabeth passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months later. Her funeral was attended not only by local residents, but by representatives from the American Embassy in Berlin and several of the former soldiers who had served at the field kitchen. As stipulated in her will, coffee was served to all attendees after the service, a blend of American and German beans that symbolized the coming together of former enemies. In 2005, the Thornton Foundation, in cooperation with the German government, established the Coffee Diplomacy Fellowship, providing funding for research and practical initiatives in post-conflict reconciliation. The fellowship explicitly drew on the lessons of the Oberhausen experience, emphasizing the importance of basic human needs, dignity, and collaborative reconstruction in healing the wounds of war. Today, the Kaffeebrücke still stands in what is now a prosperous region of Bavaria. A small museum near the bridge tells the story of the field kitchen encounter and the community's recovery. Visitors can sample a special reconciliation blend of coffee and view artifacts from the post-war period, including Captain Thornton's original field kitchen coffee pot, donated by his family after his death in 1997. The museum's guest book contains entries from visitors around the world, many expressing how the story has affected them. One entry, from a peace studies student from Bosnia, captures the enduring significance. In my own war-torn country, we are still struggling to find paths to reconciliation. This story gives me hope that even from the most devastating conflicts, human connections can emerge that transcend hatred. Sometimes it seems all it takes is the smell of coffee to remind us of our shared humanity. The story of German civilians following the smell of coffee to an American field kitchen is more than a heartwarming anecdote from the chaos of post-war Germany. It represents a profound truth about human conflict and reconciliation. Amid the grand geopolitical narratives of war and peace, it is often small, seemingly insignificant, human interactions that lay the groundwork for lasting healing. A field kitchen serving coffee, a bridge rebuilt through cooperation, a community finding agency in its own recovery. These elements combine to create a model of reconciliation that rippled far beyond a small Bavarian village. As we face contemporary conflicts and their aftermath, the lesson of Oberhausen remains relevant. Reconciliation begins not with treaties signed by distant leaders, but with moments of human connection where former enemies recognize their shared humanity. Sometimes all it takes to start this process is something as simple as the aroma of coffee, cutting through the smell of ruins and despair, promising that even after the most devastating conflicts, renewal is possible.